Уважаемые коллеги,
Well, dear colleagues, I'm happy to welcome you at the International Financial Congress organized by the Bank of Russia and devoted to various aspects of the regulation and development of the financial market. Today we're going to talk about ecosystems and the regulation of the banks and their investments into non-bank assets. They are hype and they're quite risky. This is not an ocean, but this is a big chunk of innovations. Russia issued a consultative paper consisting of two parts. First, about the way ecosystems operate and what regulation is required to avoid any distortions there. And the second part, the second section, was actually released last week, and this is about our today's topic for the session. Alexander Danilov in the studios today, Director of the Banking Supervision Department of the Bank of Russia, the brainmind behind that paper. With us today is James Watson from the rating industry. It would be interesting to hear how the rating agencies assess and estimate such investment. And online with us are two people from the banking sector and the banks that are building their ecosystems. Stanislav Bliznuk, Chairman of the Board of the Tinkoff Bank and the First Deputy Chairman of the Executive Board of Sberbank, Lev Hasis. Colleagues, good afternoon to you. And my question is to you. Probably not all of you actually were able to read that document. Maybe you can share with us some of the summary points about that report and why was what was the idea behind that report. Hello, the audience. Hello, colleagues. Still, I would urge you to read through that report, which is available from our website, and there is also a video where I more or less summarize the essence of that report. Now, I would like to really share the concept behind that report. First, we understand that new technologies enrich our lives as clients. They are important, but we also understand that uncontrolled development of ecosystems by banks would create higher risks for creditors and depositors. The key risk is the accumulation in the balance sheets of the banks of the so-called immobilized assets. Those assets that don't have any maturity there, they are quite limited in their liquidity. They are prone to high risk of devaluation, and they don't really produce any stable income. And this is also about such investment assets. During startups, some assets are not generating any profit. They may be even loss-making. Some would not repay for themselves after even some time in operation and use, and they have to be written off. And then you need to think about regulation. But how do you do that? In global practice, regulators are quite tight against such assets. They prohibit banks to make such investment. Say in the US, if you take banks that take deposits, there is a direct prohibition on that. In China, this is a higher risk, also a prohibitive measure for the banks. This is economically unfeasible to invest. In Russia, we were thinking whether we can more or less follow some balance. We don't want to really stand in the way of the progress. There's quite a number of innovations there that can be offered to the banks. Our banks are quite innovative, but we also need to reduce the risks for depositors. And one of the flexible options was to find such a balance. The essence is that we are not prohibiting banks to make such investment into the ecosystems. However, we are setting a limit, a threshold there in terms of the capital size. We said like 30% of the capital. That's your ceiling within which you can make such investment, and no more additional requirements. But if they trespass this ceiling, then you'll have to pay up with your capital, that is, with the money of your shareholders, for such a higher investment. And now, if those investments would be profitable with additional profit for the shareholders, then it is okay. But if those investments are loss-making, then it would not be on the burden on the depositors, but rather the shareholders are assuming that risk. We think that this is quite a fair approach, but 2 points there. First, we suggest that this rule, this ceiling, would cover not only the ecosystem investments, but all immobilized assets like non-core real estate, industry, etc. We don't want to have any arbitration in place. While this is a hype, then everyone is investing into ecosystem. But as soon as you have regulation, banks would be saying, no, this is not an ecosystem, this is like venture financing, etc. We want to avoid that. Second, banks already have quite a lot of those non-core investments into real estate, etc., more than 2 trillion now. And there we would like to find another keyword to that challenge. Second, this ceiling is not static. It depends on the risks of such investment, or rather our tolerance, our appetite to such risks. The more risk is associated with investment, the more requirement you have. We actually want to incentivize banks to sell off any risky assets so that they can free up space for additional investment. So this is the cornerstone. But there is another point there which is important. We also realize that the ecosystems carry additional risks for the banks that develop such ecosystems. And not only when banks are investing themselves, they may be using some partnerships, but we're talking operational risks, because you transmit a lot of data in such transactions. There's a risk of losing customer data. There are some cyber attacks, and there are also support risks. Even if some partners will carry some risks, the banks will have to support the partners, and those risks actually should be covered by the banks by the internal procedures of capital adequacy. And if banks are not adequate in meeting those risks, and if risks are higher than the measures and policies that are used by the banks internally, we would introduce additional capital requirements from 1 to 3%. Now, if we see that banks are becoming quite sizable ecosystems, or rather the ecosystems of those banks is becoming quite sizable, then we can refer to such banks to the systemically significant category, even if in terms of its pure banking business, it is not up to the mark there. Now, if the bank is a systemically important bank already, and if it has a large ecosystem, then we may have some tighter and closer look at the way it operates. These are our approaches and our ideas, but please do read from that report so that you can get some additional information there. Thank you, Alexander. Indeed, that report is quite interesting, and we do need to read through that report so that we can more or less understand the problems behind that report. Sberbank, this is the leader in more or less presenting itself as a leader of an ecosystem or as an ecosystem. And although Alexander said that he would rather prefer a third way of balancing the interests of creditors, depositors, and investors. Maybe indeed this is quite a risky business for Sberbank. Maybe they should not do that with their balance sheets. The platform in 85%, as some studies show, would not really survive more than 1 year. And although the business model is quite obvious, but to create such a network effect so that everything is more or less like working like as a clockwork, then you need to invest a lot. And banks really have some challenges there. Their capital would not cover the 100% of their investment, maybe only 15 to 20%. So why would Sberbank need such investment into ecosystems? Sergey and colleagues and esteemed audience of those who are connecting to our session today. Indeed, there are such bans and prohibitions in many countries, but not in all. And that is coming to the first part of your question, why banks in Russia have such an opportunity to invest in such ecosystems. We need to compare apples and apples and speak about regulation. In the US, indeed, banks are not allowed to invest in such, but there is a big difference. Why Russian banks, I think, have and should have such an opportunity. First, the Russian banking market, unlike the US market, is not protected against non-banking players and foreign players. Just remember the story about the US regulators kind of like limiting the large non-banking institutions to engage in banking business. Quite recently, One Financial wanted to buy a small company of MoneyGram. It was prohibited to do that, really. And it's hard to imagine for me that in the US, financial regulators would allow Google to buy a bank, or Facebook to buy a bank, or Amazon or TNT would be able to buy a bank. So, of course, the regulators in the US are handling their sectors not only from the point of view of regulations, but from the point of view of making the banking sector attractive to investors. In Russia, the financial regulators and authorities in general are quite tolerant and democratic, like telecoms, fintechs, and etc. And this is the attitude that they are exercising towards those, as well as to the foreign investors. Or take, say, China, and whether they are too liberal in their attitudes to foreign investors. Not the case. Unlike in Russia, we're happy to anyone coming our way. Now, the Bank of Russia, to maximize competition between the players, is also quite a strong player, creating also competitive advantages through law. Take the payment system of MIR or the fast transfers and payment systems. I think that this is only the beginning, and the Bank of Russia is going to be the key disruptor in the Russian financial market. And hence, I think that banks need to think about their long-term strategy. They need to answer the question of how the business is going to look like in 5 or 10 years' time. And whether banks would be prepared to become a backup just for the user interfaces and services in various high-tech platforms or not. And I think that's a big question to the banks who don't want to have such a fate. They need to be able to take care of their future. And also the goals that are declared by the Bank of Russia are the correct ones, of course. There should be some regulation to protect the interests of depositors. There should be some control mechanisms, both prudential and administrative ones. And in Russia, we do have those controls that limit the capacity of banks to invest into the shares of other legal entities. And also, differentiating banks and non-banks, I think that we are past that bifurcation, and indeed banks is something that telecoms and fintechs and others have. And to do this only for banks, again, this is going to mean that we are prohibiting the future participation in competition. We are prohibiting the direct contact with the clients. In the countries where tech companies were developing separately from banks, like in China, they quite recently discovered that many payments actually are outside the banking community. Everything is now done to regulate that, to protect the banking system of China against the invaders from the other sectors. investors. And this is something to keep in mind, and such a stronger regulation for banks would limit the financing of such companies and would create some disproportionate advantages to foreign ecosystems in their aspiration and search for an entry into the Russian market. What does this mean to Sberbank? Of course, we are studying the proposals from the Bank of Russia, and we actually read through your report, both parts 1 and parts 2, and we are looking into various ways of how to adapt our strategy and to meet the creativity of the Bank of Russia and to meet the requirements of the regulator. We always want to be in line with those regulators. Of course, you are always in line with the requirements of the regulator, but I should say that the settlement function within the country is something which is the mandate of any central bank, and we want to be really to support our payment systems, and this is normal. Now, if not prohibiting, and if indeed make sure that the banks to survive need to build their ecosystems, then not all those banks can do that. The big tech coming into the market and creating their ecosystems also generate new competition. But who has better chances? Banks with unlimited liquidity because they have access to corporate and households' money, or big tech that from time to time may have good multipliers, but they can also reach exchanges and attract good money. It's not a question about the winner, but who gets this victory cheaper, who has the advantage in the competition. Banks do have a chance, but not a big one, because regulation in Russia is already there to limit the investment of banks into such non-banking assets. So the capacity of banks to make such investments is quite limited. For example, Sberbank currently, and actually from the end of last year, the total volume of such investment into non-financial businesses was only 3% of our capital. And even if we're going to increase that share, we are still talking about, say, one-digit numbers, shares of our capital that we can spend there, because we cannot simply afford any higher investment. Regarding big tech, they do have colossal liquidity resources. If you take the biggest big tech like Amazon, its capitalization now is about 130% of the Russian GDP. However, Russian tech companies don't have any problems with financing. They have hundreds of billions of free money in their accounts, and they can always float additional shares if they need additional financing to capture a market share. And also, the success of any ecosystem depends on many factors, not only financial and liquidity, but access to technologies and to professionals. And big tech companies who have been doing this business for quite some time, they have accumulated enough experience there. So competition with banks for such resources would be quite an uneasy one. And of course, we, for example, cannot afford working as a loss-making group, while many highly valued big tech can go on for years with using their capital to finance some of their activities, just to make sure that they get a share of the market. Nobody's actually saying that they need to make profit and to pay dividends. We cannot afford that. Also, many of the Russian banks are under sectoral sanctions and cannot really mobilize foreign capital or float our papers among the foreign investors, and the big tech do have such an opportunity. So I would say big techs have broader opportunities to finance their activities compared to banks. Thank you. Indeed, this proves our point that to banks, such investment is not only the question of intentions or desire, but it is rather about the competition with the big tech that have both cultural and financial advantages to banks. Stanislav, your bank probably is falling in the middle of the way. You can get money through investment, but you also have a financial license of a lending institution, and you are building an ecosystem which is more based on partnerships. You are minimizing your capex by creating vendors and suppliers, and you are inviting partners to create a platform where you can also offer the services of third parties. By becoming a systemically important institution as an ecosystem, not as a bank, you then would be referred as a bank to the group of systemically important banks. There's a notion of too big to fail. In the financial market, together with the G20, we more or less converted this into the setting up a category of systemically important banks. But platforms are not bound by such requirements. It is not that it is mandatory for you not to fail because you are big. Now, what Tinkoff thinks about that? Good afternoon, dear colleagues, and thank you, Sergey, for inviting me here. And for the question, I would like to correct you a little bit. We are building our ecosystem indeed, but as part of our financial products, and we have a broad range of our financial products, we are still trying to develop those within our financial platforms. But when you're talking about our lifestyle products, like, cinemas, restaurants, and entertainment, we do think that such should be developed on the basis of partnerships. Why? To really come up with a competitive product, you need to be well versed in such a product. We do have some expertise in financial products, and that's why we are growing. But distracting our attention and resources to develop a broad range of products outside the financial sector is something that we cannot afford. That is why we prefer to follow the way of partnerships. And this is a win-win situation when we use a partner who is focusing on a particular activity, who would also be providing a good product there, and we are getting some benefit from that, and we are providing additional business to such a partner to scale up the business, I would say. Now, in such a partnership, it is important to make sure that our part in the partner's business would be too big to really cause some difficulties, because we don't want a partner to really depend fully on us. And in case of some difficulties and challenges, we will need to save that partner. We don't have such partners. We do see that our partners have diversified portfolios, and this is the right way. And also, partners may have some diversified business, and there we more or less avoid any monopolies, and we also help those businesses to develop. In China, you do have a business that more or less grew too big to capture the full areas of life of people. Now, in terms of being systemically important or significant, we thought that a systemic bank is a major player of the financial market. And any mushrooming ecosystems and those that are being planned to integrate and include them into this category of systemic banks or eco-platforms is premature. It's one thing to declare, announce a platform, it's another one to grow it. So it's a big task to really establish the ecosystem and to draw the attention of clients to the financial product that would be available through such an ecosystem. So, about the systemic nature of ecosystems, you probably should pay attention not only to the balance sheet and or to turnover within that ecosystem. You should probably take a closer look at the growth parameters of the ecosystem. So, if the ecosystem was right and more or less palpating the right product and area and is growing, then it is the right, and maybe it is reaching all those caps that were established some time ago, then it can be recognized as systemic. But now, of course, if they can really achieve above those caps, they can be systemic.
Right, that was one of the items that were looked at in our report. What are the criteria for government to identify whether an ecosystem is systemically important? Definitely, we don't want to put on the list everyone. It would be a nightmare. It's one thing to incorporate it into a strategy, and enforcing is quite a different ballgame. Definitely, we don't want all of the ecosystem operators to be placed on that list. We will be looking at existing ecosystems with financial services, and they will be the hard target. Okay, for example, your customers view you as a super app that gives you a broad range of services, and if they rely on this broad range of services thanks to specific products. So if something happens to this product, if it goes offline, you will have to assist that provider, that vendor, or again, you'll be fine with that step in risk when your assistance would go beyond the partnership framework, and that would force you to give up that vendor. So will you protect the partners? Will you throw all of your support behind their back? First, we focus on developing and expanding our financial services. We do have a lot of lifestyle services. We will expand their number, but they're not critically important. It doesn't really mean that the clients are with us because of them. We just want them to enjoy the overall customer experience, our integrated services, and the convenience of using all of this in one package. If one of the 50 services will not be provided, okay, we'll try to find an alternative in the market, or we'll just switch this button off, make it grey, until we find a partner who could provide reliable service. So, again, given our model, I don't really see any major risks. Any risks. We are not a major player for the partner. There are no businesses where we're more than 30% of the portfolio. Well, if there's a crisis in that company, in that vendor, it means a systemic crisis, and our financial assistance won't really help to bail them out. They would need to readjust their business model according to the current realities. So, thank you so much for this very specific answer. VTB made a major announcement. Our report would destroy the banking business and is a major barrier in regulating their activities with the customers. Well, what about Sber? What's your stance? Should we assume a broader view, or should we only focus on the core banking activities? What should be our mandate be? Well, the goal is to make sure that the creditors and the investors are protected from investment in fixed assets, in ecosystems, from poor decisions in these investments. And the idea itself is a proper one. And I don't think that people who know things about the economy would be against it. And we do support this. This is a rational, good goal. But what is the practical way to achieve this goal? That's a big issue. This is why I think we can refine some of the proposals that were made and streamline them. So the devil in the details. We need to look at the details. And there are a lot of questions related to those details. First, the 30% cap and risk-weighted. For a large number of banks, it's overly aggressive, and most of the banks would only be able to put the fixed assets under this cap. So the ratios that you set would create a lot of issues for the banks. They would be struggling even to support their core banking activities. So they would have to have 100% provisions for these investments rather than keep them as is. We did some preliminary research, some simulation calculations, and for Sberbank in general, if that's adopted as is, we will fit these criteria thanks to our huge capital and to a relatively small amount of investment in ecosystems. But for many other banks, it would be a huge blow to capital. Many banks, including major ones, may be forced to violate capital ratios. Imagine all of the measures were in place right now. The regulatory capital of the entire banking system would be down around by 2.7 trillion rubles, 20 to 21% of the total capital, the total equity of the Russian banking system. This 5-year transition period for many banks will not be sufficient to adapt, or would require a major shift in their business model, lower lending and lower investment in further growth. Now I'd like to go back to some of the ratios. According to the report, if you have arrears, they have a higher ratio as versus investment in the ecosystem, 2 versus 5. So if your bank has some illiquid assets, their coefficient will be 2, and if it's investment in ecosystem, even if it's a flourishing, fast-growing, profitable asset, it will be 5. So it's 2.5 times more profitable for a bank to have a toxic asset on its balance sheet rather than to invest in new technology. That's a paradox. If that new startup has an IPO and is profitable, then the amount of capital deduced from equity will grow, which will be deduced by 5 times and will only be added to by 1 time. That's pretty strange. So you mix everything, apples and oranges, you mix the ecosystem, you mix toxic assets, the essence, the nature of them is different. Fixed assets are not immobilized assets. They are real assets which would bring you money. They are needed to service your customers. As for toxic loans, well, you have traditional prudential regulation. As for investment in technology, you can limit by increasing the capital adequacy ratio by the central bank with all the necessary add-ons. If you believe that what you have today is fine and the rest can be redistributed between the shareholders or could be spent on investment, why invent the wheel? Reinvent the wheel. And as part of an existing prudential requirements, the regulator has enough tools to assess the quality of any assets and take regulatory action if needed. So all of these drivers can significantly improve the current proposals. As for SBER, regulation should not disrupt the implementation of our own strategy. It was adopted by the government of Russia, and the shareholders, investors have been supported, and our capitalization went up more than 40%, or more than $40 billion. It's currently almost $100 billion. But if regulation pushes us to make a step back, it could have a significant impact on our shares and their price. 50% plus one shares belonged to the National Welfare Fund. So it's very important for every Russian to make sure that the regulation that would be in place would give enough opportunities for the banks to grow and stay appealing and profitable, including for the shareholders and investors, alongside protecting the banking system. I appreciate your position. Our position and our calculations are different, and we used a different set of data. And again, I'd like to ask my colleague to comment on your counter-arguments. The answer is simple. The coefficients that you currently see in the report and that you referred to, they are preliminary. We just use them for example's sake. That later, we will get feedback from the banks on what assets could be included, how we need to group them in a proper way, and then we will recalibrate this model and this coefficient in a way to reach two goals, twin goals. Regulation needs to be efficient to cut risks for creditors and investors in this short-term horizon, around 5 years. It has to be enforceable, and it has to be realistic, it has to be feasible. We can invent any rules, but if they are not feasible, the purpose will not be achieved. So these are the two goals, the dual goals. So you can use the current coefficients for internal calculations, and that's what we did. We used this tough coefficients for top 30 banks, and we saw that this is feasible within the deadlines that we are referring to, but provided that the banks will not sit idly, just sit on their assets, but will do something with those assets, either sell them to the market or make sure that they use the proceeds to invest further, rather than just sitting on the pile of these startups. So as for your concerns, don't make any rash doomsday conclusions. That's not going to happen, I think, and we don't have any purpose like this. And I'd like to thank you. It's really great that we are on the same page conceptually. Investments do carry a risk, and you support our general approach that we need to regulate them. But how to do it? How to? Well, that's something that we can work together on, and it's really great that you've used some of these specific examples. It's a consultative report. That's the way we branded it, and we really appreciate your feedback, and we do really invite and welcome constructive criticism so that we can recalibrate it with these two goals in mind. Thank you. And now we have the independent arbitrator. The business community is on the one side, in the one camp, the regulators in the other camp, but they will always have these conflict of interest. And rating agencies are somewhere in the middle. Investors don't really like banks at the moment. So this extra benefit of ecosystems, will it help banks to attract new investors? And
And
the improvement of the shares of price of Sberbank, is it not just because of QE?
Непростой, неоднозначный.
Is it because of ecosystems too?
Инвестиции.
Well, that's a difficult question, and I'd like to give our overall assessment. There could be three types of investment in ecosystems. First, investment in non-banking but financial activities, like leasing, brokerage. That's obviously complementary to the bank's main products, that helps to expand their product suite, to keep their customers loyal. We take a neutral stance, sometimes a positive stance, except if there are no major or excessive credit market risks. On the other extreme, the third group of investment is completely non-financial assets, industrial assets, construction, real estate. Our view is completely different, usually negative, and the severity of this negative stance depends on the riskiness, the risk profile of these investments. And somewhere in the middle we have this ecosystem investment. It's not quite core, but it's complementary in a way to the core banking activities of the banks. So there are four criteria, four components that we use to measure the risk level. First is the size of investment. Second, the way they are structured legally for the banks. Is it loans? Is it equity investment? Third, profitability, rate of return, what are the prospects? And fourth, let's say a more complex one to measure, but nevertheless, it's governance at the bank, the ability to run these new projects. Thank you, that's really great. Now, in a more specific way, with all things equal, the credit rating of a bank that promotes an ecosystem investment and does not do that, which one would you prefer? If a bank can get extra revenue without too many risks, that's really positive. It's really difficult to talk about it here in Russia, partially because of the following. There are abstract ideas, and we have implementation in practice, and it's completely different. Well, you can talk about distracting some of the capital into some startups, and creditors investors can suffer, but these are like the academic representation of this. But here in Russia, there are a lot of banks that can lead by example. Sberbank and Tinkoff, they are one of the role models. And Sber's investment is not really high compared with its capital. As for Tinkoff, this business is more significant for the group in general, but it's structured in a way to mitigate the risk for the bank itself. So again, there could be academic debate, and there is more specific practical debate related to specific case studies. Okay, let's say I have one bank and another bank, and if the size of operations, if the volume of operations would grow, would that have an impact on your credit risk assessment? Yes. Are you referring to Sberbank and Tinkoff? Yes. I mean, we switched to these two case studies, calling by the names. As for Sber,
Должно было быть очень большое увлечение.
Has to be really a huge increase in investment to become,
Целостной нашей оценки банка.
to make a difference for our overall assessment. As for Tinkoff,
С другой стороны, для Тинькофф это
yes, their share is a bit higher, but for Tinkoff, it's still a favorable diversification of their business and their risks. And even if there is an increase, it doesn't really
отрицательно для
automatically mean it would be a negative one for the bank. It could be even positive. Okay, before we move to a Q&A, the final question to you, James.
В целом вопрос иммобилизованных.
In our report, we raise this issue of immobilized assets. Do you think it's appropriate? Do you think it's timely? Yes, it's appropriate, and it's the Basel Committee
виде, с другой терминологией, конечно,
might use different terminology, use different language, but they still focus on it.
оценку, конечно, важно.
It is important.
Вот, и действительно вся, не знаю, самое главное, конечно, как Александр уже отметил.
And as Alexander said, you need to fine-tune the system in a proper way to limit the risks, but not too much, not to stifle growth. Thank you. I have two questions from the audience to our panelists. Third-party financial services, will they be included in your ecosystems? Or if maybe Tinkoff and Sberbank would provide access only to their own product range? Sber, you are first. We had a conference on smart market. It's an open platform, and any participant can use that platform regardless of their product or skills. Any competitors are welcome. We believe it is the right way forward. There are clients who get service from more than one bank. Why create a problem for them? On the contrary, we would like to provide more services, including third-party services, within our ecosystem. So we're quite tolerant. As for our branded channels, it would be quite strange. You won't find an example like this. Take Apple Store. I mean, they are brick-and-mortar stores. You'll hardly see a Samsung phone there. But in App Store, you do have some competing, the virtual one, you do see some competitors. So we'll use this smart market, we'll use this smart app to promote competitor services. So what's the goal? What's the goal of coming up with these ecosystem of lifestyle services? Why do big techs have such huge capitalization? That's a growth story. Monetization is on the back burner. You first need to grow your base, and you need to have the expertise to do that. So we invest in ecosystems. We invest in VC, but monetization is not that important right now. Our idea is to increase the loyalty of customers and the frequency of the use of our services so that they can use our financial services. We've discussed that at length, what kind of ratings we'll have if a company invests in ecosystems. But we should not overlook the fact that if that service is appropriately integrated in the service, then the loyalty of a person, of an individual to the financial service, the retention rate is up, and the soundness of that financial service is improving. Going back to your question, could we have third-party financial products? Yes, it is possible. We had examples like this. We even have a similar story with Sber. our insurance products could be purchased at Sber insurance platform. That's a good case study. We give a convenient way for our client to get our product. If Sber is a good platform for them, okay, we're fine with that. And my final question from the audience, according to the preliminary assessment, regulatory capital would go down by 20%. That's Sber's assessment. What is CBR's assessment? I'd like to ask you to do that, and maybe you can wrap it up. We have 1.5 minutes left. Well, we didn't calculate that. We just measured whether the system can, within these 5 years, comply with the new regulations by taking certain action, definitely. We believed that they'll have to offload some of their assets by selling off and make new investment.
У нас получается, что по топ-30 мы делали, что это выполнение.
So we did that for top 30, and we believe that's still possible, and there won't be a big impact on capitalization.
Поэтому вот еще раз никакого такого там апокалиптического сценария.
So again, we don't see any apocalypse there. Colleagues, thank you very much. We are within 50 minutes. The report on the road to the consultations is open and was open last Wednesday. So please do read from the report.